The next item of business, that concludes topical questions. The next item of business is a statement by Nicola Sturgeon on the Scottish Government's Programme for Government 2019-2020. The First Minister will take questions at the end of her statement, and I would encourage members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak buttons as soon as possible. And I call on the First Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I begin today by welcoming Sarah Boyack back to Parliament and welcoming Beatrice Wishart to Parliament and wish them both well. Presiding Officer, the centrepiece of this programme for government today is our work to tackle the climate emergency. However, I must begin today by addressing the political and constitutional emergency that is engulfing the UK. Today in the House of Commons, MPs from across the political divide will seek to block the possibility of a no-deal Brexit. And given the anti-democratic move last week by Boris Johnson to shut down Parliament, it is absolutely vital that this effort succeeds. SNP MPs will do everything possible to stop the UK crashing out of the EU without a deal. Scotland did not vote for any form of Brexit, and having a catastrophic no-deal Brexit imposed upon us is completely and utterly unacceptable. Of course, as long as this outcome remains a risk, the Scottish Government will do all we can to mitigate the impact on families, communities and businesses across our country. We will also work to minimise the impact on this programme for government. But clearly, if a no-deal Brexit happens, it will not be possible to remove that impact entirely. Presiding Officer, most importantly of all, we intend to offer the people of Scotland the choice of a better and more positive future as an independent nation. The referendums bill introduced before recess is about to resume its parliamentary progress. I can confirm today that during the passage of the bill, we will seek agreement to the transfer of power that will put the referendum beyond legal challenge. We have a clear democratic mandate to offer the choice of independence within this term of Parliament, and we intend to do so. Of course, it now seems inevitable that there will be an early UK general election. So let me be crystal clear today. The SNP will put Scotland's opposition to Brexit and our right to choose independence at the very heart of that contest. Presiding Officer, it is easy to feel, and with good reason, that the last 12 months have been dominated by Brexit. But in Scotland, we have made important progress in creating a better and a fairer country. We have established a new social security agency, which is now providing assistance to more than 90,000 people across our country. We have made progress in closing the attainment gap in our schools and widening access to our universities. We have continued to recruit childcare workers and build or refurbish nurseries to prepare for our unprecedented expansion of early years education and childcare. World-leading domestic abuse legislation has come into force, and according to the most recent figures, our exports have grown more rapidly than those of the rest of the UK, while our unemployment rate is lower. This year's programme for government builds on that record. The year ahead will consolidate Scotland's position as a leader in the battle against climate change. It will see landmark policies long in the planning come to fruition. For example, the new National Investment Bank will be established, and our massive expansion of free universal early years education and childcare will be delivered. We will continue with record investment in and reform of health and social care, and we will take game-changing action to tackle child poverty. This programme for government will reinforce Scotland's place as a dynamic, open, innovative economy, and it will also help us to build a fairer society, one which is defined by our concern for the rights, the dignity and the well-being of every individual. In short, Presiding Officer, while the Westminster Government shuts down, this Scottish Government is stepping up. Earlier this year, I acknowledged that Scotland, like the rest of the world, faces a climate emergency. Shortly after, I confirmed that the Scottish Government would accept the recommendations of the UK Committee on Climate Change. We have now committed to achieving net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2045 at the latest. That's earlier than any other UK nation. Parliament, of course, will have the opportunity to pass this legislation in the autumn. This year's programme for government is an important part of our response to the climate emergency. It lays the foundations for a new Scottish Green Deal with measures to reduce emissions, support sustainable and inclusive growth, promote well-being and create a fairer society. However, while the measures I am setting out today are significant, they should not be viewed as the sum total of our efforts. In the next 12 months, we will receive the recommendations of the Infrastructure Commission, publish a finalised transport strategy, complete our capital spending review, renew the national planning framework and publish an updated climate change plan. All of this work is vital in ensuring that Scotland becomes a net zero emissions nation. Last year, I set out a new infrastructure mission for Scotland to increase annual infrastructure investment by 1% of GDP by 2025. Tackling climate change will be central to the investment decisions that we make. One area where we must act is transport, currently responsible for more than a third of Scotland's greenhouse gas emissions. I can therefore announce today the following actions. Firstly, we will continue to support the growth in electric and ultra-low emission car use as part of our aim to phase out new petrol and diesel cars by 2032. Scotland already has one of the most comprehensive charging networks anywhere in Europe. Last week, I announced a pioneering new partnership between the Scottish Government, Scottish Power and SSE to deliver more charging points and the electricity infrastructure to support them. And I can announce today that over the next year, we will help more businesses and more consumers buy ultra-low emission vehicles, including second-hand ones, with a further £17 million of low-carbon transport loans. On aviation, I am announcing today a bold aim to make the Highlands and Islands the world's first zero-emission aviation region, with flights and airport operations fully decarbonised. I can advise Parliament that we will trial low or zero-emission flights during 2021, quite literally piloting new technology here in Scotland. And we intend to decarbonise all flights between airports within Scotland by 2040. We will also continue to electrify Scotland's railways. Around 3/4 of passenger journeys in Scotland already use electrified lines. That proportion will continue to grow. Where electrification is not practical or desirable, we will invest in battery-powered trains and explore the potential of hydrogen-powered trains as well. Detailed timescales for this work will be set out in the spring. However, I can confirm today our overall aim. Scotland's rail services will be decarbonised by 2035, 5 years ahead of the UK ambition. Of course, the vast majority of public transport journeys in Scotland are by bus. In the last 8 years, the Scottish Government has supported the purchase of almost 500 low-emission buses. But we need to do much more than that. So we will work with the new Scottish National Investment Bank, the bus sector and potential investors to seek new forms of financing. By doing so, we aim to significantly increase the use of low-emission buses across the country. However, if we want to encourage more people to travel by bus, we must also make it a quicker and more reliable option. I can therefore announce today a major, indeed a transformational capital investment programme. Over the next few years, we will work with councils on the design and delivery of schemes to reduce congestion through new priority routes for buses in and around our towns and cities. And I can confirm today that we will back this with new investment of more than £500 million. Last, but by no means least on transport, we will continue to support active travel. Last year, we doubled our annual investment in cycling and walking from £40 million to £80 million. I can confirm today this increased level of investment will be maintained. It is currently enabling 11 large-scale projects, the first of which, Glasgow's South City Way, will be completed next year. Presiding Officer, lowering emissions from transport, especially in our cities, is essential for our environment, but it is also vital for our health and well-being. The next phase of Glasgow's low emission zone will start next year, and we expect low emission zones to be in place in Edinburgh, Aberdeen and Dundee. However, I can also confirm today that we will consult on the further steps we need to take now to achieve the transition to zero emission city centres by 2030. As well as in transport, we will also intensify our actions to reduce emissions from heating and housing and tackle fuel poverty. We are already investing £500 million in energy efficiency measures over the lifetime of this Parliament. In December, we will update our energy efficiency route map, which is our energy retrofit scheme. We intend to accelerate progress towards improved energy performance certificate ratings in Scotland's homes. We will enhance building standards to help us deliver zero and low carbon homes and buildings. And in particular, I can announce today that from 2024, a year earlier than planned for the rest of the UK, we will require all new build homes to be heated from renewable or low carbon sources rather than fossil fuel boilers. These steps will be accompanied by additional support from the Scottish Low Carbon Heat Fund, which will provide a minimum of £30 million for renewable heat projects, including heat pumps. We will also introduce a heat networks bill to regulate district and communal heating networks in a way that supports their growth. All businesses, third sector organisations and individuals have a role to play in tackling climate change, but the public sector has a special responsibility to lead by example. That is why we will mobilise our £11 billion procurement budget to help meet our climate change targets. And this will include a consultation on new legislation to legally require public bodies to set out how they will use procurement budgets to meet their climate change and circular economy obligations. I can also announce today that publicly owned Scottish Water, the biggest purchaser of electricity in Scotland, will commit to becoming a net zero company by 2040. By 2030, it will aim to produce or host 3 times more renewable energy than it consumes. Now, many of the steps I've outlined so far to reduce emissions from transport and heating are dependent on a decarbonised electricity supply. So we will continue to support renewable energy. Next year, we will publish an action plan for the development of hydrogen. A new offshore wind policy statement will set out our plans for that sector, including, of course, how we secure more economic and supply chain benefit from our offshore wind resources. And I know, and I have to say, I understand why many climate change campaigners and others argue that part of our response to the climate emergency should be the immediate withdrawal of support for oil and gas. However, aside from offshore licensing and regulation being reserve matters, the hard fact is that the early closure of domestic production before we're able to meet all demand from zero carbon sources would be likely to increase emissions, because a significant proportion of the oil that would then require to be imported has a higher carbon intensity than UK production. However, the oil and gas sector does have a much bigger role to play. So I can confirm that our support for oil and gas will now be conditional on the sector's actions to help ensure a sustainable energy transition. As part of that, we will work with the Oil and Gas Technology Centre to help develop renewable technologies that can be integrated with our existing oil and gas infrastructure. One of those technologies is carbon capture, utilisation and storage. Scotland has the potential to store huge quantities of carbon dioxide under the North Sea. So we will work with the Scottish National Investment Bank to explore how we can help industry develop this technology, and we will continue to press the UK Government to develop the UK-wide frameworks needed to make it a success. Scotland has the opportunity to become a world leader in this essential industry of the future, and we must grasp that opportunity. Presiding Officer, we will also continue our efforts to reduce waste and to reuse and recycle materials more effectively. To encourage this further, we will introduce a circular economy bill in the coming year. Among other things, it will enable charges to be applied for items such as single-use coffee cups. And finally, we will ensure that our land use, including our agriculture, our forestry and our peatland restoration, is consistent with progress towards a net zero economy. We will support the development of regional land use partnerships between now and 2021. We will develop an agriculture transformation programme, and we will invest an additional £5 million to increase our tree planting target from 10,000 to 12,000 hectares next year. Further detail of all of that will be set out in the updated climate change plan. Responding to climate change, of course, is not simply a moral obligation, although it is. It is also an economic and a social opportunity. It provides us with an incentive to make our air cleaner, our lifestyles healthier, and our cities and landscapes even more beautiful. So we will also act to ensure that Scotland benefits economically from being one of the first countries in the world to move to a net zero future. The Scottish National Investment Bank, which will become operational next year, will invest at least £2 billion over 10 years, providing patient finance for ambitious companies and projects that can help us to achieve key national missions. I can confirm today that the bank's primary mission will be securing the transition to a net zero economy. We will take other steps too. Under the current growth accelerator model, which is currently helping to deliver the new St James's Centre here in Edinburgh, for example, local authorities borrow to fund the public infrastructure which is needed to encourage private investment in key projects. I can announce today that over the next few months we will work with councils to establish a new green growth accelerator. This will enable local authorities to invest in and encourage greater private investment in projects which reduce emissions and boost growth, in effect a form of green city-region deals. The Scottish Government will also develop and bring to market a green investment portfolio of projects worth at least £3 billion, covering areas such as heat, waste, power generation and property. We are, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the best countries anywhere in the world to invest in low-carbon or net zero projects. By promoting the green investment portfolio, we will ensure that that fact is known to investors around the world. Presiding Officer, we are also determined to ensure that the transition to net zero happens in a way that is consistent with our wider vision for a fairer and a wealthier Scotland. The Just Transition Commission will produce an interim report early next year on how the decarbonisation of our economy can reduce inequality and also promote decent, fair, high-value work. The challenge of guaranteeing good jobs is also why I am announcing that we will develop and publish a Climate Emergency Skills Action Plan. This will build on the Future Skills Action Plan that has been published later today. To guarantee good jobs, we must ensure that people have the skills needed for new techniques in construction, energy efficiency, manufacturing and transport. Skills training, not simply for our young people, but for people at all stages of their working lives, is an essential part of ensuring that people are not left behind by technological change in the way that they too often have been in the past. Presiding Officer, all of these actions demonstrate how moving to a net zero economy is compatible with our ambitions to boost Scotland's productivity, increase our sustainable growth rate, and be the country that designs, develops and manufactures the key innovations of the future. To further support these ambitions, work will start this year on the £48 million National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland. The Lightweight Manufacturing Centre is already open and helping companies to secure the support and the services that they need. We will also maintain our increased funding for research and development with the aim of doubling business investment in R&D by 2025. And we will continue to support key sectors of our economy. The programme for government details our actions to support sectors such as food and drink, life sciences and industrial biotechnology, digital and data, and the creative industries. In the coming months, we will launch a new tourism strategy, followed by an action plan in the new year. We are determined to support this vital sector at a time when its extraordinary recent success is presenting challenges as well as considerable opportunities. In recent years, a great boost for our tourism sector has been the reputation Scotland has earned as a first-class host of major events. Later this month, Gleneagles will host the Solheim Cup, and next year Glasgow will host 4 matches for the Euro 2020 football tournament. The UEFA European Championships Bill will therefore form part of this year's legislative programme. It will help ensure the successful delivery of the games hosted by Glasgow and meet the commitments required by UEFA to prohibit ticket touting and protect commercial rights during the event. This programme also recognises the vital importance of ensuring that all parts of Scotland benefit from economic growth. We will continue to support city-region deals and regional growth deals. We will also support the rural economy. By the end of the year, we will publish the first ever National Islands Plan. And by April next year, we will have established South of Scotland Enterprise. We will also continue to deliver improved digital infrastructure to every part of our country. Our commitment to provide access to superfast broadband for every home and every business in Scotland is the most ambitious of any government anywhere in the UK, which is particularly impressive when we consider that it is largely a reserved matter. The £600 million R100 programme will take superfast broadband coverage from its current level of more than 90% to 100%. And by the end of this year, we will have awarded the contract to deliver it. We will also work to ensure that Scotland's economy benefits from strong international connections. We will continue to implement our export plan, recruiting new in-market specialists for our enterprise agencies, working with chambers of commerce to deliver more trade missions, and encouraging experienced exporters to act as mentors for newer companies. Last year, Scotland's goods exports increased by almost 13%, and we are determined to see that figure grow even further. I can also announce today that we will launch a new foreign direct investment plan to attract new investment in key sectors of our economy. The plan will also enable us to offer support to start-ups specialising in technology or low-carbon industries anywhere in the world if they choose to relocate to Scotland. We will also continue to pursue a balanced and progressive approach to taxation. We have already ensured that the majority of people in Scotland pay less income tax than they do elsewhere in the UK, while those who can afford to pay proportionately more. We've ensured that across all transactions we have the most competitive rates in the UK for non-domestic land and buildings transaction tax, helping to make Scotland a more attractive location for potential investors. And for residential LBTT, 80% have paid no tax at all or less than they would have done under stamp duty rates. And our relief for first-time buyers has helped almost 8,000 people in the last year alone. Full details of our tax plans for the year ahead will be set out as normal as part of the budget bill process. However, I can confirm that in the year ahead we will consult on and introduce legislation to give councils the power to apply a transient visitor levy, often called a tourist tax. This will enable local authorities to introduce such a levy if they consider it right in their local circumstances. And of course, that is a further example of our commitment to devolve more power to local councils across our country. Presiding Officer, our approach to taxation is intended to encourage business investment and economic growth, and also provide us with the resources we need to fund world-class public services. Next August, we will deliver one of the defining commitments of this current parliamentary session. Around 80,000 families in Scotland will start to benefit from our expansion of early years education and childcare. All 3- and 4-year-olds and all 2-year-olds from poorer families will be eligible for 30 hours a week of free early learning and childcare during the school year. That represents a total investment of more than £900 million each year in giving our children the very best start in life. And it will save parents up to £4,500 per child every year. We will also continue our work to close the attainment gap in schools and raise standards for all. We are currently investing more than £180 million in the attainment fund, and to allow schools to plan ahead, I can confirm today that we will continue the fund until at least March 2022. We will also provide further support for head teachers in the year ahead, and we will start to deliver the recommendations of the independent panel on career pathways for teachers. I can also announce today that we will make an additional £15 million available this year to improve the experience of children who have additional support needs and their families. And we will shortly announce the first set of schools to be built through our new £1 billion school investment programme. As the Deputy First Minister confirmed earlier, a priority of that new programme will be to work with Fife Council to rebuild Woodmill High in Dunfermline as quickly as possible after it was so badly damaged by fire last week. Presiding Officer, as well as investing in childcare and schools, we will continue to invest in our colleges and universities. And in the next year, we aim to deliver 30,000 modern apprenticeship starts, meeting the commitment we made in 2016. And we will continue to widen access to university, building on the progress that we've seen in recent years. To support this, we will increase our investment in bursary support for eligible students in both higher and further education. The Independent Care Review will report early next year. I have been clear, though, that we should not delay making changes now that will help level the playing field for care-experienced young people. I'm therefore announcing a further package of commitments today as a down payment on the longer-term changes that the review is likely to recommend. For example, I can confirm that in the coming year, we will remove dental charges for care-experienced people between the ages of 18 and 26. We will ensure access to discretionary housing payments for care-experienced young people in receipt of a qualifying benefit. We will extend entitlement to early learning and childcare provision to 2-year-olds with a care-experienced parent. We will create a statutory presumption in favour of siblings in care being placed together where that is in their best interests. And from the start of the 2021 academic year, we will remove the age cap of 26 for access to the care-experienced student bursary. Presiding Officer, children and young people who grow up in the care of the state deserve to be loved and supported to reach their full potential, and I am determined that we will live up to that. Alongside our investment in education and services for young people, the programme for government again provides record levels of support for our precious National Health Service. Last year, we set out a major package of investment in mental health services. We will continue to deliver better support for new mothers who experience mental health problems, and we will meet our pledge to provide an additional 800 mental health professionals by March 2022 in settings such as hospitals, GP surgeries and prisons. The first tranche of the 350 counsellors that we committed to last year will be working in our secondary schools in this school year, and I can confirm that they will all be in place by this time next year. This year, working with COSLA, we will implement our plan for a community wellbeing service across Scotland, supported by £17 million of additional funding over the next 2 years. This service will focus initially on people aged between 5 and 24, though I can advise Parliament today that we will also begin to consider how it can be extended in future to people of all ages. This is an important investment in the well-being and the happiness of our young people, which will bring both short-term and long-term benefits for our society. We will continue to direct more resources to primary care, increasing the number of GPs entering training, investing in general practice nursing and supporting the recruitment of more link workers, paramedics and pharmacists. By 2021, this additional investment will total £500 million a year. We will invest more than £100 million over the next year to implement the Waiting Times Improvement Plan. We're also continuing to invest in better facilities for elective procedures, such as hip replacements. Construction will start on major new centres for elective treatment in Livingston, in Inverness and in Aberdeen. We will also ensure that our accident and emergency services, which for the last 4 years have been the best performing anywhere in the UK, continue to be world-class. We have already opened major trauma centres in Aberdeen and Dundee, and in the next year, work will progress in new centres in Edinburgh and Glasgow. In light of the situation with the new Children's Hospital in Edinburgh, which the Health Secretary will provide a full statement on next week, I can also confirm that we will establish a new body to oversee NHS infrastructure developments. We will also work with COSLA to increase the effectiveness of health and social care integration, and we will continue to fund the implementation of Frank's Law, which ensures that anyone who needs personal care has access to it without charge, regardless of their age. Presiding Officer, alongside these improvements to health and care services, we are also taking steps to help people live healthier lives. 2 years ago, I announced an additional £20 million a year to reduce the harm caused by drugs in our society. The drug death statistics published over the summer reinforced the scale and the urgency of that task. The situation we face is a public health emergency, and our response must recognise that. I'm therefore announcing today additional investment of £10 million in each of the next 2 years. This extra funding will help the Drug Death Task Force support new and existing projects and test different approaches. It will also help to improve the provision of opiate substitute therapy, and a new Inclusive Scotland Fund will involve people who have experience of severe multiple disadvantages in developing approaches to improve outcomes and save lives. At the moment, UK legislation prevents us from introducing the medically supervised overdose prevention facilities that experts say would make a difference. We will continue to seek the powers we need to take this action, and I call again on the UK Government to accede to that request. And we will also consult on wider reforms to drug laws so that the Scottish Parliament is ready to act when we have the power here to do so. We will also take action on other public health issues. Active Scotland is promoting healthier lifestyles, for example, by increasing support for community sports hubs in deprived communities. In addition, by autumn of next year, we will have made improvements to school meals. We will set maximum limits for the consumption of red processed meat, increase the amount of fruit and vegetables served, reduce the amount of sugar available, and encourage the use of fresh local produce. That is in line with the aspirations of the Good Food Nation Bill, which will be introduced this year. Scotland's international reputation for quality food and drink isn't always reflected in our diets. The Good Food Nation Bill will provide a statutory framework for our efforts to promote healthier and more sustainable local produce. We're also continuing our work to restrict the promotion and marketing of food and drink high in fat, sugar or salt, and we will bring forward a bill on restricting food promotions in next year's legislative programme. In addition to our investment in education and health, we will also support the cultural sector. I confirm that, having consulted and received, I think, 200 responses, we will publish our new culture strategy later this year. Presiding Officer, we will also take, over the coming year, further steps to tackle poverty in our country. We invested an estimated £1.4 billion last year in support for low-income households. That includes almost £100 million to protect people from the impact of disgraceful UK welfare cuts. Scotland is currently the only part of the UK to have statutory targets for reducing child poverty. To help meet those targets, I can confirm that we will introduce legislation for a new Scottish child payment of £10 a week. And, Presiding Officer, I am very pleased to announce today that we plan to make the first payments to eligible families with children under the age of 6 by Christmas next year, ahead of the schedule we set out before the summer recess. All eligible families with children under the age of 16 will receive payments by the end of 2022. This investment will provide more than £500 a year per child for the families who need it most. We estimate that when it is delivered in full, the new child payment will lift 30,000 children out of poverty. Anti-poverty campaigners have described it as game-changing, and I think they are right to do so. The child payment will be delivered, of course, by the Scottish Social Security Agency. In its first year of operation, the agency has supported more than 90,000 people through the Best Start grant, Best Start Foods and the Carer Allowance Supplement. I can confirm that later this month, the first funeral support payments will be made to help families on lower incomes struggling with funeral costs. Later this autumn, young carers will start to receive £300 a year through the Young Carer Grant. And I can confirm today that from spring next year, assuming we get the cooperation we need from the UK Government, young people will start to receive the Job Start payment. That's a new payment to help around 5,000 young people with expenses such as travel costs and new clothing when they return to work after a period of unemployment. And then in summer next year, we will introduce disability assistance for children and young people. Presiding Officer, these are all further steps towards establishing a social security system based on the principles of fairness, dignity and respect. And it couldn't be in sharper contrast to the one operated by Westminster. That basic commitment to social justice must also underpin our approach to homelessness and housing. We are in the first year of a 3-year investment totalling more than £32 million in our rapid rehousing and Housing First programmes. These will support hundreds of people in the coming year. In addition, we will launch a £4.5 million fund this year for third sector organisations involved in tackling homelessness. It will enable them to improve and in some cases transform the services that they provide. Over this Parliament, we will invest more than £3.3 billion in affordable housing. Indeed, I can announce today that we are firmly on course to meet our target of delivering 50,000 affordable homes, including 35,000 for social rent. Presiding Officer, I am also delighted to confirm that in December this year, we will launch a new £150 million national pilot scheme to provide first-time house buyers with up to £25,000 towards their deposits. This programme for government also includes vital measures to protect our communities and strengthen human rights. We will support our fire and rescue service and protect the police budget. Among other things, this support will enable police officers to spend more time in their communities through the use of mobile technology. We will provide further protection to service animals by implementing Finn's Law as part of our Animal Health and Welfare Bill that will be introduced as part of this year's programme. We have significantly increased capital spending to modernise our prison estate, and having established the Victims Task Force last year, we will continue to put victims at the heart of our justice system, for example, by investing in facilities for child witnesses to give pre-recorded evidence. We will introduce a forensic medical services bill to improve services for victims of sexual offences. This is an important part of our ongoing work to ensure that these victims receive better support and that their cases are handled more effectively by the justice and healthcare systems. We will make other important improvements to the criminal and civil law. A new hate crime bill will consolidate and update existing hate crime legislation. Indeed, the vital importance of tackling hate crimes, including those prompted by religious and racial hatreds, was underlined by the unacceptable sectarian disorder that took place on the streets of Govan last Friday night. We will introduce a redress bill for survivors of in-care abuse, setting out how financial redress can be paid to survivors of historic child abuse who were in care in Scotland. The Defamation and Malicious Publications Bill will modernise the law in this area. It will balance the protection of people's reputations with the important principle of free expression. And we will introduce a civil partnership bill enabling mixed-sex couples to enter into civil partnerships. The Scottish Government will continue to take steps to strengthen human rights and promote equality. We will hold our next Race Equality Conference early next year. We will implement key recommendations of the National Advisory Council on Women and Girls, for example, by establishing a new collaborative to promote gender equality across Scottish public life. And we will continue our work to tackle the gender pay gap. We will also work to advance Scotland's reputation as one of the most progressive countries in Europe for LGBTI equality. As part of this, I can confirm that we will consult on the details of draft legislation to bring Scotland's process of gender recognition into line with international best practice. In addition, although legislation for this does not feature in this year's programme, I can reaffirm our commitment that the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child will be incorporated into Scots law before the end of this parliamentary session. The National Task Force for Human Rights Leadership will continue its work to develop a new statutory framework for safeguarding human rights in Scotland. As I said at the outset, we also have to prepare for the possibility of Brexit. We will work with others to try to block a no-deal Brexit and to prevent Scotland being removed from the EU at all. But we must plan for all eventualities. This year's legislative programme includes 2 measures which are directly linked to Brexit. The Rural Support Bill will enable us to modify elements of retained EU law which relate to the Common Agricultural Policy. It will also provide us with new powers for the collection of agricultural data. These powers will be needed if Scotland has to leave the EU, since we would seek to simplify and improve CAP legislation. The Continuity Bill will allow the Scottish Government and Parliament to align devolved law with EU law. In particular, it will provide us with the power to keep pace with changes to regulations and standards which are subsequently made by the EU. And by doing so, it will send a clear signal about Scotland's desire and our ability to rejoin the European Union. Alongside these crucial legislative changes, we will continue to plan for the possibility of a no-deal Brexit with a focus on ensuring continuity of medicine and food supplies and providing reassurance and support for EU citizens. As long as no deal remains a risk, we will do everything we can to ensure that Scotland is as prepared as we can be. However, unlike the UK Government, we will be honest about the inability to prevent all of the harm that a catastrophic no-deal Brexit would inflict. Presiding Officer, it is worth making the point that these measures, although vital, are about mitigation, about making UK Government decisions less damaging than they might otherwise be. Mitigating bad Westminster decisions should not be what this Parliament is all about. We should be focusing all of our energies on the positive decisions that will secure the best future for our country. The opportunity to choose that better, more hopeful future as an independent country is one that Scotland deserves, and this Government is determined to offer it. Presiding Officer, to conclude, this programme sets out how this Government will get on with the job of building a better country. It puts people's health, prosperity and well-being at its heart. By this time next year, 80,000 families will be benefiting from more than 1,000 hours of free childcare. We will have delivered 30,000 modern apprenticeship starts. We will be even further on the way to delivering 50,000 affordable homes. We will have introduced a further 4 social security payments. We will have established a Scottish National Investment Bank. And we will have confirmed our global leadership in the fight against climate change. This programme sets out actions for the next 12 months, which will make a difference for years to come. It details measures which can help make our country the best in the world in which to grow up, learn, work and live. It meets the challenges of the future while staying true to our enduring values, and I commend it to Parliament.
Thank you. The First Minister will now take questions. We've just under an hour for that, and I would encourage members to press their buttons. Jackson Carlaw.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too welcome MSPs back to the Chamber after an eventful summer for us all. And can I welcome back Sarah Boyack, and can I also welcome Beatrice Wishart, sitting next to the architect of her victory, Willie Rennie McIntosh. But let's look at the SNP's record this summer. £500,000 wasted settling a bungled case with the First Minister's predecessor, tens of millions at risk thanks to a bungled and delayed ferry contract on the Clyde, and worst of all, families in this city asking why a state-of-the-art children's hospital is still not open years after it was supposed to be. Now, with every government programme statement, there are measures that can be supported. We will examine the detail rigorously, and where there are, we will. But the First Minister's statement was a classic of the genre. Every September, we hear the same long list of self-congratulating, grandiose promises. Remember the education bill that was going to transform schools, long since binned. The big plan to devolve a new raft of benefits to this Parliament, delayed. Remember the state-owned energy company. Does anyone even remember Sturgeon Energy? In total, Presiding Officer, 30 promises in previous programmes for government under this First Minister, broken or delayed. When that's her broken record, frankly, why should anyone believe that this latest wish list will ever be delivered?
First Minister.
Well, the one thing I took out all of that, if anybody was listening carefully, was that the Tories wouldn't have saved shipbuilding jobs on the Clyde, which is no great surprise, is it? The Tories have never been trustworthy on shipbuilding, and they never will be. Take the education bill. The provisions of the education bill are now in operation earlier than they would have been if we'd taken legislation through this Parliament, getting on with delivering. But, you know, I know, and it's hard not to sympathise, that the Tories are leaderless and adrift. But, you know, they've published a press release today that is bizarre and includes claims that are simply factually wrong. It is riddled with inaccuracies and misrepresentations. I could go through it one by one, but I'm just going to give some of the highlights. They claim we haven't introduced a family law bill. I'm afraid we have introduced a family law bill. They claim we haven't introduced drug driving offences. We pledged we would do that. in 2019, and they come into force next month. They claim the attainment gap isn't closing. It is. The gap is now at a record low. They claim that the Digital Growth Fund was delayed. Their own press release actually admits it was delivered on time, but still claims that it was delayed. They claim that a recent report on early learning and childcare reveals the expansion is not on track. In fact, the report explicitly and expressly says that it's on track for both 2-year-olds and 3- and 4-year-olds. And they use out-of-date figures for the Scottish Growth Scheme, ignoring the fact that 201 companies have received £135 million of investment. And then they have the nerve to make a number of nonsense claims about social security. I really would have thought that the party of the rape clause and welfare cuts would have decided to keep quiet about social security. But you know, Presiding Officer, more than anything, what is staggering is the hypocrisy of a party that has barely passed a single piece of meaningful legislation at Westminster in years and is right now trying to shut down Parliament. That hypocrisy is gobsmacking. Well, while the Tories shut down Westminster, the Scottish Government will concentrate on stepping up and delivering for the people of our country.
Jackson Carlo.
Burst the balloon, and it's a lot of hot air, I think, there. This is the party that would sink the building of 5 frigates on the Clyde. It's rich to talk about our commitment to shipbuilding. And we don't even have to look back across the whole summer or even the whole week to see the SNP's failings. This morning alone, the Scottish Government's own statistics exposed its failings in the NHS. 4,000 empty nursing and midwifery posts, 500 empty consultant posts. In mental health, child and adolescent waiting times have fallen again, with 1/3 of vulnerable youngsters waiting too long for care. This summer, we learned that patients and staff already putting up with the SNP's shambolic workforce planning will also now have to wait for the opening of the new Sick Kids Hospital serving the east of Scotland, a hospital that was supposed to have opened in 2012. So let's talk about a programme for government. First Minister, on what date will it open?
First Minister.
On NHS workforce, Jackson Carlo might be interested to know, I'm sure he knows already, that staffing levels in the NHS have increased by over 13,200 whole-time equivalent staff members since the SNP took office. That's a 10.4% increase. And I'm going to take no lectures on staff vacancies in our National Health Service from the party of Brexit, who are currently cracking down on migration and sending a message to EU nationals so vital for our health and social care services that they are not welcome on this country. Shame on the Conservatives for the damage they are doing across the country. On the Edinburgh sick kids, a clearly unacceptable situation, but Jean Freeman did what I hope any responsible health secretary would have done, and prioritise patient safety, and then take a number of actions to make sure that confidence and assurance could be given to patients who would use that hospital. I don't know, I can't remember when I came into the chamber whether Jackson Carlaw was already here, but if he was, he would have heard the Health Secretary give an update today, and also heard her say, as I think she had previously made known, that when the 2 strands of work that she instructed, the first from National Services Scotland and the second an audit into the governance report, she will make a further statement to Parliament next week to give the certainty to patients across Edinburgh about the next steps for that hospital. That is the responsible way to govern in these difficult situations. But again, when it comes to responsible governance, the Tories right now don't have a leg to stand on.
Jackson Carlo.
The responsible thing in government would have been to make good on your commitment to open the hospital on time in 2012. And this year, the First Minister's new batch of promises centre on climate change. So let's talk about our government's climate record so far. Missing a key recycling target by 12 years. Barely halfway to meeting a target on renewable heat generation. Meeting just 7 of 20 international biodiversity targets. And streets in Glasgow and Edinburgh are failing to meet legal standards to clean air. So what has the First Minister been doing this summer during their climate emergency, she declared? Well, she opened up the new Edinburgh Airport terminal, and earlier this year she burned the equivalent of half a tonne of coal, jet-setting to the United States to push independence. So, First Minister, we're behind you in the need to tackle climate change, but between book festivals, are you really going to give it a shot this time?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, we're on track to meet the recycling target. The Tories, in this bizarre 30-point press release they issued today, have managed to accuse us of being 12 years behind meeting a target that hasn't actually fallen due to be met yet. That's how ridiculous what they are publishing and how grasping at straws that they are. We have set out a range of actions that we are taking. Scotland is already recognised by those who don't have the same axe to grind as Jackson Carlow and the Tories, recognised by international experts as being ahead of the world when it comes to meeting our climate change targets, to leading the world in the actions that we're taking, and what we are setting out today will take us even further down that road. In terms of Edinburgh Airport, and some of that expansion, of course, is about trying to meet their own environmental targets. But in his press release today, Jackson Carlow has just criticised me for visiting Edinburgh Airport. In his press release today, he criticises us for not going ahead with the cut in air departure tax. So he's got to decide which side of the climate change debate Jackson Carlow is on. The fact of the matter is we have the most ambitious climate change targets, not just anywhere in the UK, but almost anywhere in the entire world. And we have the most ambitious programme of actions to meet them. And again, I think it is probably embarrassment that is making his face go a little bit red when he looks at the actions and the achievements of this government compared to the government of his own party, which is so obsessed with Brexit, it's forgotten how to do anything else.
Jackson Carlow.
Not my skin tone again. Listen, First Minister, at least I've got a full head of my own naturally coloured hair. Finally.
All right, order, please. Order. Order, please. Order,
Finally,
please.
how typical that the First Minister's statement today both begins and ends with independence. It really is literally her be-all and end-all. She's confirmed her plan to push ahead with her unnecessary and unwanted referendum bill. And buried in the small print, we see that the SNP's utterly discredited white paper from 2014 is finally to be binned. And she has made clear that, regrettably, and with no consensus from across this Parliament, she intends to demand the power to hold a referendum on independence. Faced with this, Scottish Conservatives surely speak for the majority of Scotland when we say, we've had enough, just give it a rest.
First Minister.
Well, let's first of all not gloss over the fact that within a matter of days of losing their female leader, the interim leader has managed just to insult practically every woman in the country with that, I would say, rather ill-advised quip at the start of his rather ill-advised rant. But let me say, I mean, Jackson Carlow, when he's got a bit more time, might want to properly reflect and digest the significant domestic policy agenda that I have just spent 40 minutes outlining to this Parliament. But, you know, he should also reflect on the fact that over the past few days, we've had the revelation, and I should say before I say this, I don't doubt the personal reasons Ruth Davidson gave for her resignation, and I, as I did last week, wish her well. But we've had the revelation that, you know, Ruth Davidson doesn't want to put up with Boris Johnson as leader of the Conservative Party. We've had a debate re-erupt in the Conservative Party about whether it's time for the Conservative Party to become independent. And yet we still have a Conservative Party that is determined to deny the right of the Scottish people to choose our own future with independence. Well, I make no apology for saying when I look at the chaos and the disaster that the Tories are currently leading the UK into, that I want Scotland to have the ability to choose a better, more hopeful, positive and optimistic future. I want us to rejoin the family of independent nations, and I'm determined we will get that chance.
Thank you. Can I just encourage all members and all party leaders, including the First Minister, not to make personal quips. Can I ask members to stop pointing across the chamber and think about your own comments? Richard Leonard.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the First Minister for advance sight of today's statement, and can I welcome the commitments on climate change and the undertaking that tackling the climate emergency will be woven into every aspect of government, and can I address politics, not personalities. A year ago, the First Minister told us, and I quote, "Closing the attainment gap and raising standards in our schools remains the government's overriding mission." Today, the First Minister commits to raise standards for all and says she will continue to deliver the attainment fund until 2022. But that clearly is not enough. This summer's exam results show that the pass rate for Highers has fallen for the 4th year running. So, First Minister, when will this government start to raise standards for all?
First Minister.
Well, I am absolutely certain that if Richard Leonard studies the figures, as I'm sure he has, he will see, as I have referred to already today, the attainment gap in our schools is now at a record low. There is much more work to be done, but we see the progress as a result of the actions we've taken, as a result of the investments from the attainment fund that is leading to that narrowing. On the exam results, in terms of the higher pass rates, there will be fluctuations year from year. If the higher pass rate was to go up every single year, then we would have opposition politicians telling us the exams were getting too easy. But if we look at National Fives, we've seen an increase in the pass rate, particularly good increases, I think if memory serves me correctly, in maths and English. At higher, we've seen a good increase in sciences. So we continue to take the action to reform aspects of our education system and to invest where that is needed to see both that attainment gap narrow and standards increase. And we will continue to do that with the range of actions that we set out in today's programme.
Richard Leonard.
Let me turn to another area then. Last year, we welcomed the First Minister's commitment to adopt Labour's long-held policy to increase the provision of mental health support in communities, including schools. However, only 1/5 of the promised investment in school counselling has been released, and community services for 5 to 24-year-olds are still in development. And just this morning, new figures published show that the government's pace of change is clearly not quick enough, with over 30% of children and young people referred to mental health services not being seen within the 18-week target time. So, First Minister, can you give assurances to families across Scotland? When will you ensure that this crisis in children and adolescent mental health services is finally addressed as a matter of national priority?
First Minister.
It is a matter of national priority, and the actions we set out last year are being taken forward, as we said they would be. If you take counsellors, for example, as I said in my statement, the first counsellors will be working in our schools in this school year. We've reached agreement with COSLA on the funding to ensure that all of them are in place by this time next year. Our commitment to additional school nurses, for example, is already in implementation and will be on target to meet that full commitment. In terms of the community wellbeing service, introducing new services like this, and this one in particular, I think, has the potential to radically transform how children and adolescents access mental health services. Of course, that takes a degree of planning to implement. We will move to the implementation of that over the year ahead. As I said today, although the priority at this stage is the age group 5 to 24, we will also begin to explore how we can make a service like that available to other age groups. And one of the key things about this service is that it will be available not just for children to be referred to by other professionals, but they will be able to self-refer to this system, which I think is an important way forward to make sure that we have much more preventative, more preventative services available to relieve the pressure on our specialist services, but also to make sure that those specialist services are there for the young people who need them. So all of this work is underway, and I appreciate that Richard Leonard has raised issues in the past around rejected referrals, which we've also done a lot of work on. We don't want to see any young person is referral rejected unless it is for clinical reasons. So this is a significant piece of priority work that is underway and will continue to gather pace in the year ahead.
Richard Leonard.
At the weekend, the First Minister wrote in a national newspaper that it is more important than ever that the Scottish Government continues to act in a calm, considered and consensual way. Can the First Minister tell us, is she calm that housing costs continue to rocket beyond people's means? Is she calm that the reliance on food banks in Scotland is at an all-time high? Is she calm that public transport is run in the interest of profit and not passengers? And so, given that the First Minister is calling for consensual working, can I ask her to back our plans? Will you support the Mary Barber bill to cap private rent rises? Will you support our plans to enshrine the right to food in law? And will you finally support Labour plans for a publicly owned bus network and a publicly owned railway?
First Minister.
Well, can I just say to Richard Leonard, I am not calm about the fact that right now Tory welfare cuts, Tory austerity, the Brexit obsession of the Tory government is driving more and more people in this country into poverty and more people to food banks. The difference between me and Richard Leonard is I want to do something about it. I want to give people in Scotland the option of a different future, a better alternative, so that we take control of these issues into our own hands rather than leave them in the control of a UK Tory government. On the specifics Richard Leonard raises, the right to food, I've said we're introducing a Good Food Nation bill. Of course, we are open to discussion about provisions that others want to bring forward, and as we have done in the past, we will listen carefully to the points that are made. On housing, we have taken action in terms of the rent levels in Scotland, introducing rent-pressured areas, but again, I am open-minded to where further action can be taken, and I'm very happy to have constructive discussions with Labour or with anybody else across this chamber. I think it is most important of all that we continue to invest in new housing to increase the supply of housing. I have, in my own constituency alone, opened 2 new housing developments in the last 2 weeks. Evidence of that £3.3 billion investment that we're making in affordable housing, and will continue, of course, to take action through Housing First to tackle homelessness. So we will discuss with others across the chamber in all of these things. One thing I'm surprised, I don't know whether Richard Leonard's about to ask me another question, but I'm very surprised given the number of times that he raised it, understandably and rightly raised it with me over the course of the last year at First Minister's questions, calling on us to introduce a child income supplement. I'm very surprised that Richard Leonard hasn't commented on the fact not only are we introducing a child payment, but that we are accelerating payment of that to children under 6 to Christmas next year, described by poverty campaigners as game-changing. And having called for it for all of these months, I'm surprised Richard Leonard didn't find it within himself to warmly welcome it.
Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I also welcome Sarah Boyack and Beatrice Wishart to the Chamber? And can I join with everybody who hopes that none of us will be judged on the basis of having a full head of hair? The language of the Green New Deal has been adopted by the Scottish Government, and I welcome that. It was first proposed by us in a debate in April, and our Green New Deal paper was published just last week. But I don't think the Government has yet taken on the central idea of a change of economic system, and there's a great deal of focus still on consumer choices and as yet unproven future technology. On transport, for example, transport emissions are going up, not down, yet the programme for government focuses on things like electric planes and battery trains. Well, maybe one day they'll have a role to play, but they won't cut transport emissions now. And freezing active travel funding at less than 1/10 of the trunk roads budget won't do so either. Greens believe in free public transport, and one step the government could take now toward that, which would be affordable, simple, popular, especially with the taxi service of mum and dad, and would shift journeys onto public transport now, would be free bus travel for young people. Will the First Minister dispense with vague commitments like consulting on options and working with stakeholders, and just do this now?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, I think all of what we're putting forward today in terms of tackling climate change is important, the short term, the medium term, and yes, I make no apology for some of the longer term ambitions so that Scotland is at the forefront of the technological advances that we do need to see, because that's how we position ourselves to get the most economic benefit out of that. So we will continue to ensure that we are putting forward the plans to attract the investment we need, encouraging behaviour change, but also leading by example in the actions that we take. I would say on the active travel budget, we doubled the active travel budget. So I think just to say we've frozen it, we doubled it and we're maintaining it at the doubled level. I think Patrick Harvey's been slightly disingenuous in that description. On public transport, I mean, what we've announced today in terms of more than £500 million commitment to design and implement priority bus schemes is really important. Well, I'll come on to the cost in a second, but when I speak to people in my urban constituency, one of the biggest barriers to people using the bus more is actually the journey times, or the perception about the longer journey times. So if we can increase journey times, make bus travel more reliable and quicker, then we will do a lot to encourage more people onto the buses. In terms of the cost of bus transport, I mean, we already spend over £200 million a year on free bus travel. That gives free bus travel to around a quarter of the population already, and accounts for a third of all bus journeys already in Scotland. And the Programme for Government confirms our commitment to extend free bus travel to companions with disabled children, extend free bus travel to young carers receiving the Young Carer Grant. We're also piloting an extension to modern apprentices, and we're also reviewing options for extending public transport concessions to people under 26. So we are open for discussion and all of that. But in terms of the cost, and I say this not as somebody who is opposed to this, but simply as a statement of reality. When Labour came up with the free bus travel idea but failed to do any costing around it, we looked at some of the numbers of this. You're talking in the region of an additional £400 million over and above what we invest. So if parties genuinely want to get into that space, then fine. But parties have to come forward with ideas about where we get that money as well. So I signal today we are open-minded to all of these discussions. But as I so often say in this chamber, it's not a fair comment necessarily to direct to the Greens, but it's not enough just to come forward with more spending calls. You have to also come forward with ideas about how we reshape a budget in order to pay for these things.
I appreciate the detail of the programme, but can I ask the First Minister to be slightly more succinct in the answers? Patrick Harvey.
Yes, indeed, Presiding Officer. The First Minister could just have said yes to my proposal, which for young people would cost 1 or 2 tens of millions and is clearly affordable if the government has the will to do it. But the focus on techno fixes tomorrow instead of change today goes beyond transport. Things haven't moved on from the first Green New Deal debate, when the government was unwilling to accept that transition also means moving away from high-carbon industries. However many years the oil and gas industry has left to it, it is simply not plausible for the First Minister to use the rhetoric of the Green New Deal while saying that the fossil fuel industry has a bigger role to play in the future. The First Minister even went so far as to describe carbon capture and storage as a renewable technology, which it very clearly isn't. Working with the fossil fuel industry on a response to the climate emergency would be like working with the tobacco industry on a public health strategy. The First Minister wants us to accept that we can't end the use of fossil fuels overnight, and I do accept that. Will she accept that we already have far more fossil fuels in existing reserves than we can afford to use, and the exploration forevermore must come to an end?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, just before we leave buses, I don't know if Patrick Harvey heard me say in my original answer, because he went on to specifically focus on young people, that we are currently looking at the options for extending public transport concessions to people under 26. That is currently under consideration, and we'll give details of the outcome of that as soon as possible. I hope Patrick Harvey listened carefully to what I said about oil and gas today. I speak to young people in particular all the time who say, why not stop, leave it in the ground? And I've got sympathy with the sentiment behind that. But I've not heard Patrick Harvey address the point about if we did that now, the risk of increasing emissions because of import substitution. We've got to have a managed and a fair and a just transition, and that is what we are working to. But I've been very explicit today about the conditionality of our support and the emphasis being on that transition away from fossil fuels into low carbon and renewable sources. And that, in my view, is the right way to go. And I think, again, we are ahead of most other countries in the world in doing that. And lastly, I don't think it is an either-or between action now and also looking to develop the technologies of the future. I think we've got to do both. And if we do it cleverly and smartly, then we reap a lot of economic benefit in the process.
Willie Rennie.
It's good to see Sarah Boyack back here, and it's an absolute delight to see Beatrice Wishart sitting right beside me. When I stood here last year, I said that mental health waiting times for young people were unacceptable. Back then, 208 young people waited more than a year. Today, 1 year later, that number has more than trebled to 735. And suicide by young people rose by 50%. The mental health strategy was delayed. Its funding was late. Workers remain unrecruited. Why is this government letting down young people on mental health?
First Minister.
Willie Rennie raises important issues here, so I'm going to address them seriously. I don't agree with his characterisation at the end of his question, but I will leave that to one side. Long waits for children and adolescent mental health services are unacceptable. We have been making reforms and investment to tackle those long waits, and there is work still to do. So in recent years, we've invested more in CAMHS staffing. Just in the last year, we've invested £4 million in 80 additional CAMHS staff, and we're starting to see the impact of that investment. We are taking forward the recommendations of the Children and Young People's Task Force with a strong focus on improving CAMHS, and I've already spoken today about how we will further take forward and implement the community wellbeing service. I don't think it is fair to say that posts are unfilled. We have made a commitment over a period of time to increase the number of counsellors in our schools, the number of school nurses, the number of mental health professionals across different settings, and those commitments are being progressed, and I've given some updates on them today, and I'm happy to give more detail. This is a very important issue, one that I do not underestimate the importance of, but the work we are doing to make sure that the services are there in the right places so that specialist care is there for those that need them is work that we're going to stick at and deliver on.
Willie Rennie.
The trouble is, she tells me this every single year, and the numbers continue to get worse. It's far too late and far too slow for young people right now. And it's not just mental health where the government is failing. They've got a sick kids hospital with no sick kids, an energy company without any energy customers, West Coast ferries with no passengers, Shetland ferries with no funding, school testing with no support, buses with no passengers, ScotRail trains with no crew. The First Minister tells us today she is tackling the climate emergency, but public transport is on its knees. Her government backs Heathrow expansion and it's dumping domestic waste in England. This government has truly taken its eye off the ball. And as we've heard today, at the front of her speech, it's all really about independence. Why is the price of this government being paid in communities right across Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, I don't think Willie Rennie really does himself any credit with that long list of hyperbole and misrepresentation. So across health, education, justice, climate change, public transport, yes, like all governments, we face challenges, but we are getting on with meeting those challenges, making the investments, delivering the reforms that are about reshaping those services and delivering, and we will continue to do that. I make no apology, and I can't believe, I can sort of understand why the Tories will try to justify why Scotland should just put up with what's happening in the UK right now, with all of the damage that that will bring down the track. I don't understand why the Liberal Democrats argue that as well. I do not believe Scotland should be left powerless at the mercy of an increasingly right-wing Conservative government prepared to do whatever damage it wants through Brexit. I want Scotland to have a better alternative to that, and I'm determined that Scotland will have a better alternative to that.
Thank you. We've got a very large number of members wishing to ask questions, but not enough time. So Please be succinct. Bruce Crawford, to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, President Officer. Can I add my congratulations to returning Sarah Boyack and to Beatrice Wishart. Can I also very much welcome the announcement of £500 million to help transform bus priority infrastructure and routes. This forms one of the headlines of a substantial package of climate change action in the programme for government. Could the First Minister outline how this investment will help increase the uptake of bus services and improve the health of people in our towns and cities by reducing congestion and air pollution?
First Minister.
Well, as I said to Patrick Harvey, and I'm sure all of us experience this in our constituencies, one of the biggest barriers to people using the bus instead of cars is that they think the journeys will take longer. So this investment is a capital investment. We will work over the next year or so with local authorities to design schemes in and around towns and cities to put in place priority bus routes so that we can have bus travel that is quicker and more reliable than it is right now. And that will help us reduce congestion. It will help us reduce emissions in our towns and cities, which, as Bruce Crawford rightly says, is important for our health and well-being as well as for the environment. We'll also continue to maintain the doubled level of active travel investment to encourage people to walk and cycle more. And I know in my own constituency that investment is delivering some really ambitious schemes that will transform cycling and walking across the city. So this is all important stuff, and I think it's stuff that really matters to people who are thinking themselves about how they make a personal contribution to tackling the climate emergency.
Murdo Fraser, followed by Angela Constance.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister referred to the Scottish Government's R100 programme to deliver superfast broadband to 100% of Scottish households by 2021 and said that the contract will be awarded to deliver it by the end of this year. But in 2017, the Scottish Government told us that suppliers would be in place and ready to start building by early this year. Why is this programme already running 1 year late? And by what date will Scottish householders have the superfast broadband they are all waiting for?
First Minister.
I'm genuinely quite shocked that Murdo Fraser has got the audacity to go here, given the fact that connectivity, digital connectivity and telecommunications is a matter, as the Westminster Minister was reminding me on Twitter last week, it is a reserved matter. It is Scottish Government investment that has taken levels to more than 90%, and it is Scottish Government investment that will take it to 100%. The commitment, the R100 programme, both in terms of coverage and in terms of the speeds being offered, is way ahead of anything else, anywhere else in the UK. Of course, we need to get value for money out of the bidders for the contract, which is why we are taking the time to get that right. But once we've delivered this, and once Scotland has the broadband connections that nobody else in the UK has, I look forward to continuing this discussion with Murdo Fraser, who may or may not be in a different position by that time.
Angela Constance, followed by Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister has always been a consistent champion of gender equality, and it's a real shame that with one glib comment, Jackson Carlaw has undid all his great work to tackle the disadvantages women still face when it comes to their health. So can I ask the First Minister, on behalf of organisations such as West Lothian Endo Warriors, to demonstrate how her programme for government will do more to address women's health inequalities going forward?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Angela Constance for raising an important health issue. The programme for government has a commitment to developing a new women's health plan. And I know it's something that the Health Secretary and indeed the Chief Medical Officer are very passionate about and committed to. Obviously, more details of the plan will be shared with Parliament as it progresses, but it is intended to include action to ensure rapid and easily accessible postnatal contraception, reduce inequalities in health outcomes which affect women in particular, so for example endometriosis and antenatal care, and also improve services for women undergoing the menopause, as well as look at some of the inequalities in women's more general health, cardiac services, for example, one of the biggest killers in Scotland, where interventions and medications often don't take account of the differences between men and women. So this is an important piece of work. I hope it's one that will be welcomed across the Parliament and one that MSPs of all parties will engage closely with.
Monica Lennon, followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you. The First Minister rightly described Scotland's drug death crisis as a public health emergency. Page 102 of the programme for government says that the government is doing everything that it can. But I wonder if the First Minister really could look thousands of bereaved families in the eye and repeat that claim to them. Indeed, is Parliament doing everything it can? Because I think that we are not. Additional funding to tackle drugs harm is welcome and well overdue, especially as it follows a backdrop of successful real terms funding cuts to alcohol and drug partnerships, which has fallen by 6.3% since 2014. The First Minister could seek to legally designate a public health emergency and urgently direct the resources of our public services towards tackling this crisis. That's one of the actions that Scottish Labour has been calling for. So since the First Minister agrees that the drug death crisis is a public health emergency, when will she instruct the Public Health Minister to legally recognise this crisis for what it is?
First Minister.
I'm genuinely not sure I fully understand Monica Lennon's point about legally designating something. We are saying quite clearly that this is an emergency and the actions that we take in response to that are commensurate with that description. I mean, Monica Lennon asked me to look families in the eye. I meet families in my own constituency regularly who have been affected in one way or another by drugs and talk to them both about what they think works well and what they think needs to work better. I visited just over the summer a project in my own constituency. So I know that we need to focus on the deaths crisis in particular. It is complex, but that does not mean that we shouldn't and cannot have a properly joined up approach to that. I 2 years ago announced additional funding for drug and alcohol services. The extra funding today is 10 million in each of the next 2 years, which I know from services in my constituency will make a big difference. The Drugs Death Task Force will be instrumental in considering both the existing and the new approaches that could benefit from that money. And lastly, and I think we do have the support of Labour on this, we have to do everything we can within our powers, responsibilities and resources. But there is a bigger issue here about drug law and the effectiveness and fit-for-purposeness of drug law right now. We're seeing it with the debate over the facility in Glasgow, or the facility that Glasgow wants to establish, but it is a more general issue. So we will continue to do everything we can, recognising the emergency, but I hope we can build even more consensus across this Parliament that we need powers here to look to see whether legislative reform actually can play a bigger part in this solution as well.
Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Liz Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The announced investment in improving bus services is very welcome as part of a wider package to reduce the emissions across all modes of transport. But could the First Minister set out in further detail her government's plans for greener travel by the likes of car, rail and also air?
First Minister.
Well, we've got to take action to reduce emissions across all modes of travel. Patrick Harvey was right to say emissions from transport, they're about a third of our total emissions. They have been increasing. In car travel, the biggest thing we have done is set that ambitious target of 2032 for phasing out diesel and petrol cars. We have already invested a lot in a charging network. The partnership we announced with the power companies last week will be vital in making sure that we can accelerate that progress, but also make sure that the electricity grid infrastructure there is there to support the network, and we're making more money available for people to buy cars that are electric or ultra low emission. And one of the big differences probably wasn't particularly caught in what I said in my statement. We're extending those loans to cover second-hand low emission cars for the first time, so people don't have to buy new ones. On the bus service, and my answer to Bruce Crawford, I set out the capital investment around buses. We also need to see greater investment in low emission buses, and there is a role for the Scottish National Investment Bank there. And in air travel, of course, we want to encourage people not to use air travel when there are better alternatives, but sometimes that is not the case, and therefore I do slightly take issue with Patrick Harvey that it is not. I think it is right to focus on how we get different technology to reduce emissions from aviation. So right across the spectrum here, all of these actions are about reducing emissions from transport, because if we don't do that, we won't meet our overall targets, and that won't be acceptable to us or to anybody else.
Liz Smith, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you. First Minister, Scotland will very soon receive just under 1.9 billion of Barnett consequentials thanks to the UK Government's recent announcement of extra school funding in England. So can I ask if that additional funding might be used to restore teacher numbers in Scotland?
First Minister.
Forgive me, Presiding Officer, long, bitter experience as First Minister and before that as Health Secretary has taught me to wait and see the colour of the Tory money before we start spending it. So let's just wait and see whether it's netted off against savings elsewhere and what the actual money coming to the Scottish Government might be. And then, of course, at that point, we will set out how we intend to invest any money. Of course, it has to be seen in the context of the cuts to our budget from the Tory Government since 2010, and it also has to be seen in the context that per head of population, of course, we already spend more on health and education than the Westminster Government does. So we will continue, as we do with all of the resources at our disposal, invest them in the best way to serve the interests of people across our country.
Bob Doris, to be followed by Ian Gray.
Presiding Officer, I welcome that the poorest families, including in Maryhill and Springburn, will receive an additional £500 per child, and that the first payments initially for under-60s will be delivered by Christmas next year. Will the First Minister provide further details regarding the welcome acceleration of this policy commitment, and will this commitment require the cooperation from the UK Government to ensure smooth delivery so that those who most need that cash will get it as soon as possible?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, in relation to this, as in other aspects of our social security programme, because of a range of factors, we do need the cooperation of the UK Government, so we're in close contact and counting on them that they will continue to give that cooperation. As Aileen Campbell set out before the recess, when she made the announcement of the new Scottish Child Payment, we would require to do some further work on delivery over the summer. We've done considerable amount of work over the summer and are now confident that we can introduce the first tranche of the payment to children under 6 by Christmas next year. Applications will open in the autumn of next year with the first payments then made before Christmas. So I think that is a really positive step. We should remember that 60% of all children living in poverty live in a household where there is a child under 6. So this will make a big difference, and when the policy is fully rolled out, more than 400,000 children, which is over a third of all children in our country, will benefit from it, and it's got the potential to lift 30,000 out of poverty. In actual fact, this is one of the most important things that we are now doing as a government, and I hope those who've called for it, even those who've opposed it, will now get behind it, because it's going to make a big difference to kids the length and breadth of Scotland.
Ian Gray, to be followed by Jenny Gilruth.
The Scottish Children's Services Coalition have shown that resources for pupils with additional support needs have been cut by £889 per pupil since 2012. So the funding announced today is about £75 per pupil. So no matter how welcome it is, it barely restores a tenth of those cuts. Does the First Minister understand how much these children and their families are being let down every day?
First Minister.
Well, within a very difficult financial climate, and I don't want to rehearse arguments of the past, we've treated local government fairly. Education spending is going up in councils, and that is important because that also enables resources to go to children with additional support needs. This extra funding today, I think, is important, and I recognise that Ian Gray did welcome it after a fashion, but it is vital that we continue to direct resources to young people who most need them. And I hope that as we set out plans for how that investment will make a difference, albeit I accept Ian Gray will still argue for, as he's entitled to do, more investment, but I hope we will get good engagement and a welcome for the difference that this money can make to young people across the country.
Jenny Gilruth, to be followed by Miles Briggs.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the significant further £1 billion worth of investment in our schools. Can the First Minister confirm if this programme will deliver low-carbon, digitally enabled learning environments for the benefit of pupils in my constituency and across the country?
First Minister.
Yes, I mean, the programme, and remember we've already built or refurbished hundreds of schools. This is a new £1 billion programme to build on that, and part of the objective here is to make sure schools for the future are low carbon, that they are digitally enabled, and they also have better links to other parts of the community. The Deputy First Minister spoke earlier on in the context of Woodmill High and Dunfermline about the plans to co-locate with a new college campus. Now, obviously, we've got some discussions about what's best for that school, given what has happened, but that kind of connectivity is, I think, really important to how we want to see this programme develop. So shortly, of course, we will set out the list of schools that will be the first to benefit from this programme, and I hope there will be many members who will benefit from that in their own areas.
Miles Briggs, to be followed by David Torrance.
Presiding Officer, over the summer, First Minister, I visited a number of drug and alcohol partnerships and services for drug users, and I want to understand the First Minister and the Government's progress on this, because many of our drug and alcohol partnerships are cutting funding for services, and these services are closing today. So can I ask the First Minister, in terms of what she intends to take forward, will she make sure that youth services are looked at? Because last week in Dundee, at the Lockheed Community Hub, they told me that Young Addaction is closing all services in secondary and primary schools. So what action will the First Minister take now, not from a task force?
First Minister.
Well, I specifically actually think this is an important issue. I've had conversations over the summer with people in different services who've also expressed to me a view that the £20 million that we announced 2 years ago hasn't all got to the front line. Now, I'm not criticising alcohol and drug partnerships, but clearly that's something we've got to focus on. I was very deliberate in what I said about the additional money that I've announced today being there to support existing services, as well as the kind of new approaches that the Drugs Task Force may come up with. And I think it's important that we have that twin approach. I don't want to say too much more, because I think there's work to be done in discussion with some of the stakeholders about where that money is best spent. But I do want to acknowledge the point about existing services and recognise that that's one that we've got to very much have at front of mind.
David Torrance, to be followed by Pauline McNeill.
Figures show that while youth unemployment in Scotland is constantly lower than the rest of the UK, it remains higher than those of other age groups. Could the First Minister assure my younger constituents that our government's plans will aid them into work, especially those on low incomes?
First Minister.
Yes, I hope that assurance can flow from the programme for government. We are very committed to ensuring that our employability system provides the support that people need when they need it, regardless of their age and circumstances. Building on the principles of Fair Start Scotland, we are developing a new approach to employability services, and the aim is to support those who are furthest away from the labour market by creating a much more joined up and flexible approach. And the new Job Start payment will help young people in particular who've had a long period of unemployment and are trying to move into work, with some of the added expense that they will incur, buying new clothes for a new job, or buying a bus pass in order to get to work, these kind of things. So I think all of this is important, are important measures to help those who need the help most access work. Unemployment is very low in Scotland. Youth unemployment is much, much lower than it was a few years ago, but we know there are still people who need that extra help, and we're determined that they get it.
Pauline McNeill, to be followed by John Mason.
There has been a recent rise in homelessness applications not referenced in the programme for government. I ask the First Minister what measures the Scottish Government will take to support local authorities to meet their statutory duties to homeless people, particularly in the light of Shelter's action against Glasgow City Council, where homeless people were denied their legal rights over 3,000 times. I do want to put on record my support for the mention of homelessness prevention for women. But does the First Minister think it's time for a broader public duty, legislative duty that is, on all local authorities and public authorities to prevent homelessness?
First Minister.
Look, I'm always prepared to consider arguments for additional legislation. As our legislative programme this year and in past years will demonstrate, there is definitely a role for legislation in ensuring that public bodies are focused on the things they need to be focused on. So I'm open to that discussion. I don't have a fixed view one way or the other at this stage. What I would say, though, is I think in terms of homelessness, both in rising applications but also in redesigning the services that we provide for homeless people, I don't think we need to wait for legislation. I think there is work we are getting on with doing and need to continue to do that. Obviously, we know the main reason why homelessness applications are rising. It is down to austerity and welfare cuts. But we also know that we need to have a better response to people. So that's why rapid rehousing, housing first, is so vitally important. And in response to the first part of the question, we work closely with local authorities to make sure that we are giving them the support they need to fulfil their statutory duties, and we will continue to do so.
John Mason, to be followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you very much. I very much do welcome the £20 million to tackle drug deaths, some of whom, sadly, are my constituents. I wonder if the First Minister can give any more detail on this. For example, will it include tackling underlying problems that people have that lead them onto drugs, protecting them from organised crime who sell them drugs, as well as actually making it safer to take them?
First Minister.
All of all of these things are the kind of things we need to tackle if we are to holistically tackle the emergency situation that we face. One of the things I mentioned was the new Inclusive Scotland Fund, which will be specifically about trying to involve people with multiple deprivation and disadvantage, with lived experience of some of these issues, in trying to shape the services that people need. So I hope that gives some positive indication to John Mason. Clearly, we will want to discuss with the task force, with alcohol and drug partnerships, about exactly where this money is best targeted, and we will ensure that Parliament is kept updated as those decisions are taken.
Liam Kerr, to be followed by Rona Mackay.
Thank you, President Officer. Look, the First Minister said last year her government would give victims greater say before temporary release from prison, which was a promise, been broken. The First Minister's government said last year she would give criminal justice social work £100 million, a pledge betrayed. So why should victims of crime trust a single thing the First Minister says today?
First Minister.
Well, I simply don't think that is true, nor is it borne out in reality. So in the last year, we've passed the Management of Offenders Bill. We've established the Victims Task Force, which is looking at some of the changes that need to be made to give victims a bigger say in some of the decisions that we know victims want to, in terms of impacts of crimes that can be taken into account of sentencing, of a bigger say when decisions are being taken about the release of prisoners, whether that's home detention, curfew, early release or parole. So all of these things that we set out in the programme for government last year are being taken forward, and we will continue to make sure that they do. And the Victims Task Force, I think, helps to make sure that that victim's voice is at the heart of all of these decisions.
Rona Mackay, to be followed by Mark MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I welcome the package of measures announced in benefiting those who are care experienced? It may not be obvious to everyone why the extension of free dental care is so important, so I'd be grateful if the First Minister could set out how this will help young people with care experience.
First Minister.
Well, actually, this was one of the issues that I didn't immediately realise was important. I've spent a lot of time, as members know, with care experienced young people, and this wasn't something that I thought was obvious until they set it out to me and explained it. If a young person who's had disruption to their childhood, who's moved around a lot, who's had an unsettled upbringing through no fault of their own, who perhaps hasn't been able to access regular dental care when they were children or young people, then the impact of that can mean serious dental issues occurring later in life, and that can harm their confidence, it can blight their employment prospects, their personal life. So it is really, really important. And it's like a lot of these things, when you stop to think about it, you realise that some quite straightforward solutions make a big, big difference. And that's the approach, while we're waiting for the Independent Care Review to report, that's the approach we've tried to take. Where there are obvious or changes that become obvious and can be done now, we get on and do them. And that's why I think the additional package I've announced today is important, and I hope is seen as that down payment on the commitment that we've given to care experienced young people.
And Mark MacDonald.
I declare an interest as a parent of a child in receipt of disability living allowance. I welcome the announcement regarding the launch of disability assistance for children and young people. Ask any parent who claims on behalf of their child, and they will tell you that the application and renewal process is onerous, bureaucratic and distressing. Can I ask the First Minister, ahead of the launch next summer, will the Scottish approach to application and, crucially, to renewal take a different approach?
First Minister.
In short, yes. I mean, I hope it has been recognised across all of the work we're doing in social security that we want to take an approach to how people interact with the system that is much more dignified, less complex and bureaucratic, and doesn't make them, or in this case parents, feel as if they're having to jump through hoops and go through real pain and torture in order to get what they're entitled to. I'm sure the Social Security Secretary would be happy to speak to any member about exactly how we plan to do that in the case of disability assistance for children and young people, but making sure that dignity and ease of access is at the heart of the system is a priority here, as it has been for all the benefits we've introduced and all the ones we will introduce.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our statement programme for government. Apologies to the 7 members who couldn't get in this afternoon. I hope there will be other opportunities. We're going to move on now to the next item of business.